I just wanted to add in a quick after comment at the start of the recording because this article came out in the Telegraph by Hayley Dixon. Children as young as 7 to get trans treatment. Clinics will also consider the impact of other medical and mental health issues. So I just wanted to make a comment on that so that you could have a look at it. One of the things that I want people to just be very aware of when they say things around the fact that this is a great start and there is obviously things will evolve and, that they have hope, etc. I just want to offer a word of caution in terms of being hopeful in terms of the way that the NHS worked when they write service specifications, because fundamentally, once this is your one opportunity, like this is as good as it's going to get. It's going to be downhill from here in terms of your ability to make any influence on the the dynamic, the outputs, the structure, etc. Once this is signed off, that's game over. You are no longer going to have any input into this process. It will be out into the ether. Apart from the fact, as I go on to talk about what, whilst they set up with 2 hubs, we know that there's going to be probably 8 hubs. So anyway, the interesting part about this article, which you'll begin to see that I've actually been through all of the documents on a number of different points, but I actually cannot pin down the actual point at which they use the number 7. However, essentially what they're saying is that children under 7 years of age may not be expected to have sufficiently developed their intellectual understanding of and comprehension of sex and gender to be able to understand the reasons for and potential consequences of a referral to a specialist gender incongruent service. Well, yeah, absolutely. We know that. I mean, I don't think that changes at the age of 10, 12. I don't even think, up to a 16-year-old is going to understand the concept of losing your ability to orgasm, fertility, brain development, bone health, etc. That all of those things are incredibly adult concepts. There is, as you go through the documents, or you'll see, there's so many things not mentioned, but this is obviously an interesting detail, and Hayley's been amazing on this reportage throughout the whole process. So I just wanted to add this in, and obviously you can stop, pause, read, etc. And Stephanie from Transgender Trend makes a comment here, the devil is in the detail, and I couldn't agree more. The problem is that there is real lacking in detail in the documents. This new service is a huge step forward. Well, I'm not. Yeah, let's see. So yeah, I'll just add that in. Hey, how are you? So I'm doing a little bit of a video here about the NHS service specification, which you'll probably be aware has dropped. Yeah, it's a big deal. So much so I've got my reading glasses on. So we've basically got all of these documents that came in yesterday. So I thought, other people obviously make their comments on them, but I thought I would do the kind of boring bit and show you some of the bits so that you don't have to obviously, spend a lot of the time that you possibly don't have. So I thought I'd draw your attention to them and tell you what I think. Basically, there's sort of the 2 components of it now. We've obviously been running along this one part, which was the interim specialist service that they're developing, and obviously there's various wordplay which we'll talk about. But now there's another component that they've just dropped, which is now an interim clinical policy: puberty suppressing hormones for children, adolescents who have gender incongruence. or dysphoria. And one of the reasons I've kind of done it in Zoom is because I can share my screen with you, so I can show you some of the reports, because I've kind of got them all laid up and we'll flick around them. I might even divide this into two if it's a bit laborious, but I will try and be as brief as I can. And I think one of the most difficult places to start with really in this is about the language, because essentially what we're doing is applying lots of magical thinking, and that's obviously a really kind of difficult place to start. Because the fundamental premise, which you have to get your head round with when you're trying to read these documents, is essentially what they're saying is that gender is to do with your behaviour. And what they're doing is they're trying to embed that premise into clinical policy and clinical practice. So that's a really difficult thing to work with, because they're trying to medicalise this process. So what I'm going to do, obviously, is I'm going to try and break down and start off with the use of some of the language, because that's the most difficult part that we have to try and work with. And I think that essentially one of the things that most people have got a real difficulty with is the underpinning ideological capture of the language, because, you know, people who've made comments from the gender critical side have obviously all, you know, we're all in agreement that that is one of the most egregious components, really, you know, because we have to say, you know, what is gender incongruence, what is gender dysphoria, and obviously you'll know if you've spent any time listening to me in spaces or here that I fundamentally reject, you know, the premise and concept of gender dysphoria, in terms of I don't think it's a stable standalone diagnosis at all. You know, I don't think that the DSM-5 is similarly, you know, I think that obviously it's been, you know, this is a captured ideological diagnosis too. So basically what they've gone on within this document to say is that, you know, gender essentially is about a discomfort or a mismatch about your experience of gender, you know, and you have to right off the bat say, okay, well, you know, how do we experience gender? Because what they're really saying is that this is a behavior, and that what they're doing is trying to embed this mismatch into clinical policy and into clinical practice by therefore sort of medicalizing this process, which is literally just blows my head off, because it's just so unbelievable. And this is where I start to get incredibly stressed, the fact that, you know, people on the gender critical side can, you know, go along, are prepared to go along with this without really fighting back on every single level. So essentially what they're saying is about this mismatch in language is that they're trying to pathologize the expression of a social construct, and they're trying to apply this kind of false science narrative upon this kind of crock of magical thinking. So the whole thing is really about magical thinking. So in terms of me looking at this with a kind of clinical hat on, it's essentially, it requires me to go through the wardrobe into Narnia, because none of it makes sense. But anyway, I'm going to obviously try and do it. But, you know, what they're saying is the fact that having a personality, you know, outside of the accepted norms for your sex, essentially, is deemed worthy of a medical intervention. And, you know, for you to take lots of drugs and for millions of pounds to be spent on it, and for services to be set up in order to cater for you, you know, is frankly insane. And that from that, you know, a whole load of iatrogenic harms would flow, and that potentially you would, you know, suffer lifelong morbidity and potentially mortality and clinical abuses as a result. I mean, I just don't know, I don't really understand, you know, when I then go on to sort of Twitter and look at the commentating about it, like why, when I see people, organizations make positive comments, I cannot understand how they've got from A to Z and missed out all the letters of the alphabet and not screamed about the fact that, you know, this is just, it doesn't, you know, anyway. And there's lots and lots of points that we need to cover, so I'm just going to, you know, make an effort to draw out the key ones for you. And the fact that there's hardly any mention of homosexuality, you know, being LGB, etc., and it's not significantly examined or referenced as being important. And whilst they do make a very minor mentions of autism, there's absolutely no examination of that. And I'll obviously draw out some thoughts about that as well, because I think that's really important. And one of the things that I always come back to is the fact that what they're really doing is locating the issue in the individual, whereas, you know, this is a social pandemic, which is a societal level issue, is a cultural level issue, and their duty as clinicians and, you know, people writing a huge new service specification should be to stem the flow of, you know, iatrogenic harms and clinical abuses. And I think that one of the things which is particularly relevant, because obviously I've done a bit of a quick scan before I do the second more detailed one, is that what they're doing is they keep referencing how they're going to be doing a huge amount of public input and lived experience to see what the patient thinks or wants, or what service users think or want. And I think that you know, that would make sense to me, because of course, if you haven't got any science to back up what you're doing, then you're going to need to know what the people, you know, the people want in order to guide you in the right direction, really. And the other thing that jumps out, and I'll find it somewhere, is that puberty really is described in a way as if it's actually an illness, and that's a dangerous thing for children to go through. So yet again, you know, they're locating this idea that this is a problem, and they're locating it right in the at the source point of the child. And obviously, you know, as you know, I don't believe that there is such a thing as gender identity. I fundamentally don't accept that premise. And I find it an abhorrent idea that the NHS is accepting that premise. Obviously, they don't begin to define it. And so it's just bonkers to me. So let's start with this document, Consultation Report for the Interim Service Spec, which is dated the 6th of June 2023. I think that one of the things here that jumps out at me straight away, point 2, in fact, let me get the paper up for you. So they make a comment here in this document about the marked changes in the types of patients being referred, which are not well understood. Okay, so the idea being that you would then wish to understand them better. And they especially make a mention of autistic people here, you know, neurodiverse, ADHD, etc. But in no point during any of the other points of the documentation do they actually say what they're going to do in order to find out more about this subpopulation. They literally only ever make note of populations, not what they're going to do, or if they you know, they do say they might do some assessment, but then if they do, they don't say what they will do with them, and if they will then take into account diagnostic overshadowing and then, you know, boot them out. And I think that's an important point. The next thing that comes up for me on the following page of this, establishing phase 1 service providers, they're going to be building a more resilient service. I'm not really sure what that means. And focusing on, in terms of clinical effectiveness, well, that would be really nice if they did focus on clinical effectiveness, safety, and patient experience. Whenever I see the words patient experience, my stomach starts to turn inside out, because I am always, you know, a bit wary of what that means. So what we do know is that they're establishing 2 new services, but what we also find out later on is that they're actually probably going to be 8 services. So this is just the start. But the thing on the next page that they just mentioned, also just to refresh your memory, and I did a video with Barry Wall and Robbie Travers, if you want to go and look at that one, where we actually broke down the last lot of specification. And the important point to note about this was this group tonic. Oh shit. Sorry, I've just pressed on their website. But basically what we felt about that that consultation was that this group of people were basically doing a load of social engineering via the research process, and we made quite a lot of comments about how we didn't value their research methodologies and the comments that they made, etc. The thing that I also really hate about this whole new methods that they're using is the persistent use of the equality and health inequalities impact assessment as a means of structuring NHS services, because I actually find this, the Equality Act a really unnecessary and it places a real stranglehold on the development of services and the way that they write these documents, because I think that they managed to lose a lot of the specificity and detail behind these, protected characteristics. And one of the things that jumped out at me about this was on this page here, where basically we have this thing. Many respondents also said that this proposed changes pathologizes gender dysphoria. Now, this comment here is really important, because then if you go into this paragraph down here, you find we have this comment here, therefore, while NHS England will retain this change, so what they're basically saying here is they're talking about that this service will be run, will be led by a medical consultant, and there was a lot of battling in the negotiations about whether there would be the clinical lead would be a physician or not a physician. And a lot of the gender critical side wanted it to be a physician and some didn't, etc. Nevertheless, the point being that because of the issue of puberty blockers, a lot of people wanted it to be a clinician. Now, what they're saying here, which is incredibly important, I think you need to read between the lines here, is they're saying these important words: pathologizes gender dysphoria. And then this point, therefore, while NHS England will retain this change in the interim service specification at present, we will keep this position under review, and the experience and learning from the phase 1 providers will inform whether there is a need to retain the requirement for a medical professional to lead the service in the longer term substantive service specification that will be developed once the independent review has delivered its final advice to NHS England. Now, the reason that this is important is because of a lot of the other points that we have been covering in our commentating, because there is this huge move to depathologize gender dysphoria as a diagnosis, that what they will, and because they're moving, it's not a mental health diagnosis, it's being recategorized into sexual health, because they're moving it towards it being an embodiment goal. And it's important for them not to have to be, not to require, a pathological process. And so essentially what this is leading them down the path of is this medical model will be removed as quick as a flash. And before you know it, that this is their get out of jail card. This has not been put there by accident. This is a very purposeful thing, because what they're doing is saying, even for the children as well as for the adults, that this is, they don't want this to be a medical model. And similarly, that's why they don't want this to be led by a medical doctor. Here they go on, and this has always concerned me, and I've said it before and I'll say it again. CAMS, child and adolescent mental health services, did not have the capacity in the community to provide adequate mental health coverage for its current client load. And when they've come up with this collaboration model, they said, previously that GIDS had struggled to provide the support in the previous service specification. And then in the new service specification, they're proposing to not only retain it, but perhaps even strengthen it. And in this line here, the service will require a consultation meeting between the phase 1 provider and the relevant local secondary healthcare team and or the GP. This is pie in the sky. You and I both know that even trying to get 5 minutes with your GP to talk to them about your, the multiplicity of your healthcare needs, if you've got a problem, etc., is incredibly difficult. But what they're saying here, and it might not be the GP, it could be, as they're saying here, a secondary healthcare provider. So essentially, the GP's referred you to a pediatrician, say at your local, your kid, referred your child to your local hospital. Now they're also trying to place the burden on them to then strengthen their system and put an extra time component on their management for them to have these multidisciplinary team meetings. So I think you'll find that this is an incredible workload issue. On the positive side, we've known already about the referral sources changing, and they've pulled out schools and social workers out of the people who have the ability to make referrals. And I've said before that I think that's a good idea, because certainly schools were contributing to the problem, and that was, not a good thing. So we're going to be getting another service specification, which is going to describe in detail the process for making referrals onto the waiting list. Now, one of the things about this, all of these different documents, is that it's like going on a roller coaster ride. You have to read every single word, and sometimes you think, oh, this is good, and then you go, oh my god, no, I'm sliding down on the train track. I'm like going, whoa, and you're just going up and down and up and down, and you literally have to read it like you're doing some horrific detective screen, and you have to be absolutely forensic, because what they're doing is just leaving lots of different, in my opinion, lots of different glaring little holes in order for them to be able to do get away with lots of different things. And I really, really find it incredibly disappointing. This is such a woolly section, this one on evidence. Again, they talk a little bit about, it's about social transition, essentially, what they're talking about. Kind of potentially lulling you in with a false sense of security, thinking that perhaps that they are saying that they're not going to be recommending social transition, especially unless there is clinically significant distress or significant impairment of social functioning. I can't imagine what that would actually look like in terms of saying, that a child would be significantly improved by wearing, a different attire. But nevertheless, I know from something else I've read further on in another document that this is really not what they mean. This is what's interesting in this section on social transition, on the issue of building the evidence base, because of course there is no evidence. So what they're doing is, this is a live experiment on children, and that's important to always keep in your mind here. This is literally experimentation. Some respondents suggest that clinical recommendations for the sport of prepubescent children in particular may need to be developed independently for natal boys and natal girls, because they're basically different. Of the evidence that does exist, evidence relating to children and young people who present with a non-binary presentation is lacking, because it doesn't, there's no such thing as non-binary. It is magical thinking times 10. Respondents advised NHS England that young people, their parents and health professionals involved in their care should be informed about the nature and limitations of the evidence base. It's interesting in here they say that basically there's a bit of a difference between natal boys and natal girls in terms of how they present with their incongruence, but they don't actually talk about what that might be. And obviously they're probably alluding to the fact that there is different populations of emerging, they've got homosexual, transsexuals emerging in terms of sexuality, in terms of the the teenage boy population, perhaps maybe lesbian girls. But what they're not doing is actually talking about what it is they're mean by that. So on this point, management of patients accessing prescriptions from unregulated sources, they don't mean gender GP here, because they are already working in partnership with GPs in the UK. They are, the bread and butter of their work is shared care. with both adults and children. And in fact, their main goals, it seems from, and you'll see it in another video that I'm currently editing, which will go out shortly, their main goals is to increase their workload around with children. So essentially, they would aim to have kids working in partnership with GPs, have them on puberty blockers potentially, and then you'll see further on that once they're on them, they will be able to get them straight on to one of the trial places and continue along the road. So in terms of the future commissioning arrangements for puberty blockers, we've now got this separate commissioning pile of paperwork, which I'll talk about. But what they've done is they've now set up this oversight board. They've brought in this new guy, Professor Sir Simon Wesley. That is good to go. And I think what you'll find is there's going to be a lot of kids going on to puberty blockers potentially, which is what I've been highlighting all along. I am deeply, deeply disappointed in that, because basically I don't think that one single child should have their reproductive capacity or their sexual functioning removed. I don't think any of them should have their cognitive function, brain development, bone health compromised at all. I think that it's an absolutely abhorrent idea, and I know I'm being repetitive, but I just have to keep saying it for the avoidance of any doubt. I think it's an absolutely abhorrent idea that any single person should say that it's okay for this to take place in a clinical trial. I'm just, putting that out there again. So this trial basically, we know that we know that it doesn't improve this strange phenomenon of gender dysphoria. I want to play with different toys and I want to wear a different gender's clothes, but let's try chemical castration. But nevertheless, they seem to have got themselves through the ethical and scientific approvals. And they've said that the recruitment to the study will open in 2024. Now, what I think should have happened with regards to the gender critical side is that every single person should have literally and still be doing this is shouting from the rooftops that this is unacceptable. Now, what they're saying is that kids who they start to make a bit of a delineation, which is slightly unclear. They start to talk about later onset gender dysphoria and early onset gender dysphoria, and at this point there's some divergence in terms of what they're going to be doing with these two pathways of children, but they don't actually define who they are and what age they are and what that will look like. And so the reader is left with questions at this point as to who these subpopulations are, because I am not entirely sure. But I would absolutely like to know where that deviates. I'm not really sure what this means, but it makes me very anxious. In line with the NHS England's published methods, a draft interim clinical commissioning policy relating to the routine use of puberty suppressing hormones has now begun a focused and targeted period of stakeholder testing. Fine, but after this period of testing, our patient and public voice assurance group, I do not know who they are, but I do not like those words, because that does not sound like science to me. That does not sound like objective measurements of science. That sounds like a load of lived experience and patience and chatting and undue influence, and I do not like that. So here we have the we're saying that puberty blockers are not going to be routinely commissioned, as there's not enough evidence to support their safety or clinical effectiveness as a routinely available treatment. But it should literally just stop there, okay? Because that's enough for me, and it should be enough for you as well. If there's not enough evidence to support their safety and clinical effectiveness, that's it. That's game over. And I swear to God that those people who've put their names on that, Lancet article or whatever, wherever it goes, I hope that you can all sleep at night. Okay, so we're into the interim service specification here. and we're just going to jump straight into terminology. Gender incongruence of childhood, and you might need to take a propanolol for this one. Gender incongruence of childhood is characterized by marked incongruence between an individual's experience and expressed gender and the assigned sex. So we've got, you know, NHS England using ideological language here because, you know, no one is assigned a sex. We're accurately observed and recorded. It includes a strong desire to be a different gender than the assigned sex. A strong dislike on the child's part of his or her sexual anatomy or anticipated secondary sex characteristics, and or a strong desire for the primary and or anticipated secondary sex characteristic that matched the experienced gender, and make-believe or fantasy play, toys, games or activities and playmates that are typical of the experienced gender rather than the assigned sex. Okay, so I'm sure that loads of people are now shouting homophobia at the computer, and I'm going to leave that one with you because that is genuinely just unbelievably bad. It's interesting further down to look at the population data here within this chart, and if I can just blow it up here. So you can see the age distribution here, where you've got girls on this side, boys on this side, and then the distribution where you've got from here 12, 13, 14, 15. And there's a lot of discussion within all of the different paperwork where around this point that the children essentially will be exiting off into the adult services. So there's a trajectory where they will be referred straight off into adult, but I just thought that was you might want to look at that. So basically, from that latter adolescent age point, you'll essentially have children going straight on to cross-sex hormones from there. I know I'm possibly being incredibly pedantic, but when I read these things, I just want to. They never give me the answers to what I'm looking for. Through professional liaison and collaboration support local services to meet the wider needs of children and young people, including mental health, neurodevelopmental and safeguarding and risk mitigation. It's like, what does that mean? What are you actually going to do? What are you going to do with these subpopulations? What do you mean about safeguarding? How are you going to safeguard them? You know, it's just incredibly verbose, but doesn't actually take you anywhere. This is just another reason why the NHS is on its knees. NHS England will commission a third party to support a learning healthcare system working with designated providers to build standardised workflows, apply continuous improvement, and to create a standardised data set for service evaluation through audit and research. Whenever you read these sorts of things, what have we got? We will basically be assessing, amongst other things, the clarity, persistence, and consistency of gender incongruence, the presence and impact. All I'm thinking is just how well the adolescent is regurgitating their the narrative that they've got from social media. Essentially, how well it's like taking a GCSE. You know, how well can you remember the rehearsed narrative? I'm going to do another video on this actually, and show you all the different stories that I can pick up for you on TikTok, on Reddit, and Tumblr, etc. And show you, you know, what your children or youngsters are picking up, basically, adolescents from these social platforms, because essentially this is what they're doing, is they're just regurgitating. So essentially, you know, that's what you're assessing here, really, in terms of clarity, persistence, and consistency of gender incongruence. So here you have this is complex. I appreciate, and this is where people will start to say that this is a nuanced issue here. So you're going to have a lot of families here where the kids have already socially transitioned, and what you're going to do with them. So you've got here, families may have unity around the use of names and pronouns, whereas in others this may be causing conflict and concern. And what you're going to do about them. and how are you going to, explain the ramifications and the impact? But essentially, what you'll find if you read this document is that this is essentially an affirmation-only document. So my assertion is they're going to do absolutely naff all about it, because this is so. This whole service is so pro gender ideology. Like, at no point are they actually engaging like full-scale epidemiological questioning. They make reference to the fact that they may have some epidemiological inquiry, but it's so loosely based in the way that they're the supposition and the inference in terms of future data collection and the research plan, that actually it doesn't leave the reader with any faith that that is their real goal here. The data collection looks like it really is very weak, rather than a serious attempt to find out what is going on with this, a pandemic issue, or in this case, an epidemic issue, because they're just looking at what's going on in the UK. So here you have this bit here. What section are we under? Current pathways. So that here they talk about, so we're going to have a multidisciplinary team with people who understand a bit about autism. There is thought to be an increased prevalence of neurodevelopmental disorders in children and young people. I actually hate that, young people, and even though I know that I fall down the trap of saying it myself, on the waiting list. But they don't say what they're going to do about it. Okay, so say they go, right, this person's clearly on the spectrum, they're clearly having these thoughts because they're autistic. So what? Now what are you going to do? So basically, the reason that they're having these gender identity issues and thoughts is because they went down a rabbit hole on social media, right, or in school. They're believing all this gender bollocks because of that, because they're autistic essentially, and they're literally ripe for all of this cult-like thinking. They've been, trapped into it. Now what are you going to do? Well, going by this, they're going to do absolutely naff all about it. I hate this. Assessments will focus on the subjective sense of the child's identity over time, their expression of gender identity across different contexts over time, their hopes and expectations, and that of their family members, and their stance towards the child. Any steps that have been taken. I mean, this is a medical model. These are serious drugs that they're potentially going to give these kids. This is a serious pathway of lifelong iatrogenic harms. And they're talking about hopes and expectations. Like, my hopes and expectations for my children are that they're going to be happy, that they get a job that they love because they're going to be working for a very long time in it, and that they feel really passionate about it. That's my hopes and expectations for my kids. This is just unbelievable. I would genuinely love to know who wrote this. Risk, including mental health, safeguarding, including risk of vulnerability and exploitation, and the impact of any unregulated medication. So what are you going to do now? I think I saw some reference of potentially referring people to social services. I'd really like to know more about that. And how are you going to safeguard this risk of vulnerability? Because I can guarantee you, if I now follow this up in your service specifications and your equality impact assessments, I'm probably not going to find the answer. And how does this tabulate with sexual orientation and emerging sexuality? And where's the kind of how are you dealing with issues around trauma and abuse and all the other things that people are presenting with? Okay, I've already said that I think this psychoeducation is a whole load of bollocks, basically. Because it's just going to be written by another one of these third-party providers, a bit like all the schools nonsense. It's just going to be completely captured nonsense. Unless it starts off with the sentence, gender identity is a load of bollocks, then I'm not down with it. Social transition is something that should be led by the young person with family input. Well, a couple of pages ago, you said social transition was an active intervention, and you were talking about Dr. Hilary Cass. But now you're saying that doesn't matter. It should be just basically what the child and their family wants to do. This is an important point at the end of this document: prescribing from unregulated sources and unregulated providers. So they're strongly discouraging this. But essentially, this is, as I said earlier, doesn't include people like gender GP. So if a child or young person has already started on puberty suppressing hormones outside of NHS protocols, by the time they are seen on the NHS, the service may consider assuming clinical responsibility for prescribing through NHS protocols. So this is the point that I was talking about before. This relates to all the, so I said to you that gender GP are moving into the child business. So basically, what they're doing is essentially kids will be, so gender GP are all over the place talking, raising their publicity on their child fund. So people will be going, parents will be taking their kids to gender GP, getting into a shared care arrangement with GPs potentially, getting onto puberty blockers. Then they are on the waiting list for the NHS. Then once they get into the waiting list, they get into the system, then what will happen is the NHS is saying here that they will continue them on puberty blockers if they want to, and they will put them straight into the trial, the research protocol. Now, remember, being on a research protocol, and I don't know why people think that this is something like completely different. It's literally the same thing. Okay, it just means that you sit down with a bit of paper and go, okay, there might be, you know, this, that, and the other, sign here, good, right. We'll take a few blood tests now and again, or, you know, have a bit of a chat. So that is a really important thing. So people saying the NHS is not going to be prescribing puberty blockers anymore, that is not the case, okay? And here you have the sign off. So children who from the age of 17 will be put into the adult system with a view to going straight onto cross-sex hormones. Just a word on staffing here. You know, we've seen quite a few job adverts for the new services floating around, and they're absolutely affirmation services with, you know, gung-ho gender ideologue captured. So just to kind of lay down that message. In fact, if you are of a mind to, you can always pause and read this appendix on the multidisciplinary team competencies and experience, and it will show you exactly what I mean in terms of their specifications, the things that they're expecting, the competencies for staff to meet. An understanding of the differences in sexual identity and gender identity and expression. So moving on to this, the interim service specification, the equality and health impact assessment, which I really, really do not like these documents whatsoever. Because I really hate this Equality Act framework way of writing. We have this consideration here. I'm just going to jump to the social transition part. You know, in various places, they talk about social transition being an active intervention, but I just get the impression that they're saying that because obviously that's what Hilary Cass stated in her report, and they're just sort of paying lip service to it, because basically within other parts of the document, they obviously make reference to the fact that they're okay for that to carry on and to go ahead. Here on this point, unregulated sources of puberty blockers, they're clarifying here, some respondents to the consultation confuse the reference to unregulated to mean private, but they don't mean that, because of course they want you to know that that doesn't mean people like gender GP here. Just looking at the data here, who will be affected by the changes, it's interesting to note how the data actually breaks down per cohort. So you've got people currently on, I have a bit of echolalia, so I often just get words in my head and I repeat them over and over again. Children and young people up to the age of 17 currently under the care of GIDS. So we got nearly 800 here, with a smaller number over in Wales. Young people over the age of 17 who are being put over to adult services, 887. So 18 plus is quite a lot here, where they've not quite decided what they're going to do, they say, but obviously they'll go over to adult. So this is a lot of people, a lot of children and young people on the waiting list for GIDS, waiting for a first appointment. children and young people who may be referred to one of the early adopter services in the future under the current access arrangements. Just to be a real pedant here, you know, you'd think that they would stick with one way of describing something and follow it through. Here we've got the language used in the census, which you'd think would be good enough for the NHS to use. We have gender identity, so we've got recorded gender identity the same as sex registered at birth, which obviously would be the generally accepted way of describing such a thing. But obviously I've already said that they haven't done that. NHS England have gone off with their assigned at birth language. In the disability section and in the other parts of the specification, they have made reference to doing testing for autism spectrum disorder. But you'll know that this requires psychology, and there are actually not that many people around. There's huge long waiting lists on the NHS to get an autism or an ADHD assessment. And I actually think, and it's also a very time-consuming process. This is not just like a quick thing, pop in for you know, a half hour or an hour session, and you walk out with a diagnosis. So given the amount of people who are on the children who are on the waiting list, it's just not going to be feasible for them suddenly to have this huge, you know, gamut of youngsters who all need assessment, given that we know that a high proportion of them have got autism, that they're suddenly going to have this huge plethora of clinical psychologists waiting around just to carry out all of these assessments on these children. And then what are you going to do then if you find out that they are autistic, or what are you going to do if you already know? Because this is a really, really important, this correlation causation relationship, which currently is just affirmation only, and this is what needs to be pulled apart and the chain broken. And I see none of that in this documentation. We've even got some spurious data. The UK government's LGBT surveys reported is self-identified as having a disability, and they've actually put this in a, you know, supposedly authoritative document. I'm staggered. I think one of my main takeaways from this is that there's really nothing not powerful here about sexuality. Let's just, in fact, skip to that section. Before we do sexuality, actually, let's just unpick this gender reassignment thing, because I'd like some clarification on this, because this has been an ongoing discussion that we've had on Twitter between some of the lawyers and law academics who basically have been ruminating about whether or not the protected characteristic of gender reassignment applies to children or not. And basically, despite the fact many people would wish that it doesn't, there has been discussion that it does. And one of the things which has come up again and again with regards to these documents is about how it does apply either to individuals or whole populations. So this is actually quite an important section within this part of the document, and also this case, which actually I did try to open and it doesn't open. It's a bit of a dead link. But I think it's important for you to be aware of this. So essentially what they're saying is that this case, which I can't open, they agreed that not every child or young person referred to the specialist gender service will have the protected characteristic of gender reassignment. I don't know why my voice is gone. So not every child will have the protected characteristic of gender reassignment. And in previous version, in fact, Hilary Cassidy said it's really important that they enter the service not holding the protected characteristic, because they need to be free from diagnosis, and they needed to be children in distress, because obviously it's a bit like going to the GP as a person with cancer as opposed to someone who just has, tiredness and various symptoms, etc. However, if you go through this and then also look at that case, you then get to the bottom where, in summary, many of the individuals will actually hold this protected characteristic. So it is all a bit, confusing, but, is something which has been discussed quite extensively on Twitter. So I've got to the point where I really wanted to see quite a bit of information on sexual orientation. And what you'll find here is it says, we do not hold data on the sexual orientation of the individuals who are referred or seen by the NHS commissioned service. A large UK-wide study in 2012 by the Trans Mental Health Study reported the following. Well, I'm already thinking that this isn't going to be great, because clearly they don't believe in same-sex attraction generally. They believe in same-gender attraction. So this is going to be fairly meaningless data, because already you've got this huge subset of queer population who are, confounding this data, because what the hell are they? They could be anything. Pansexual, what the hell are they? Kink, dear oh Lord. I'm not even going to make any more comments on that. So this is important, and this would be a protected characteristic which should be, properly examined, given what we know about the fact that LGBT people, internalized homophobia, etc., are an important, issue with regard to this gender identity population. The other issue, which obviously jumps out at someone like me, is a particularly vulnerable populations, like looked after children, who we know that are overly represented. And so what? So what are they going to do about it? Well, in this point, they're saying that it's an issue, but there's nothing. There's no mention of obviously what. So what? And these are my kind of fears about this way of looking and using health inequalities impact assessment in this way, because they kind of fail to then draw out what they're going to do about the system. I mean, it's not a new thing. Obviously, they've been using these forms for a very long time, but I just think that given what we know about the problems that we're having at the moment, this is, it's incredibly concerning. So as we get to the end here, we're not saying what we haven't found is any acknowledgement of the fact that we have had this stratospheric increase in a population of young girls, and it just doesn't stack up. So we need to get to the bottom of what the problem is, right? Because it just doesn't, there is a problem here. Instead, what we have is that this proposed interim service specification is reasonable and appropriate. And it's intended to confer benefit upon this cohort of children and young people by way of describing a safe service that will operate in a robust clinical governance framework, and that offers a more integrated approach to responding to a child or young person's overall and individual health needs. And essentially, up above here, we have proposals for a prospectively enrolling children and young people onto hormone treatment in a formal research programme with adequate follow-up into adulthood, with a more immediate focus on the questions regarding puberty blockers. Okay, so, puberty blockers all the way in a trial. Okay, so we've gone on to the puberty blocking section now, and there's quite a few bits of paper to have a look at. So in the evidence here, we've got overall there was no statistically significant difference in gender incongruence, mental health, body image, psychosocial functioning in children and adolescents treated with these drugs. The quality of evidence had very low certainty. There remains limited short-term and long-term safety data. However, puberty blockers may reduce expected increase in lumbar and femoral bone density during puberty. So that's incredibly important to bear in mind. The review has concluded that there's not enough evidence to support the safety, clinical effectiveness and cost effectiveness of puberty blockers to make the treatment routinely available. However, see, that should just be the end of it for me. That's because these are children. We don't experiment on children. However, NHS England recommends that they should be available, accessed through research. Okay, so that's the point where we diverge. This is important here. Those already accessing them at the time where policy is implemented, we'd need to reach a decision with their consultant endocrinologist about whether to continue this treatment. some children and young people may be eligible for enrolment in clinical research that would provide access to the drug. So basically what they're saying is that they would be directly processed into the trial, anyone who's on the drugs at the moment, probably. On an exceptional case-by-case basis, that outside of the research trial, kids might be able to stay on the drugs, but they nowhere do they actually define what they mean by case-by-case basis and what those rationale would be in order to assess what that might mean. But they do say it would go into this multidisciplinary team. So in terms of the stakeholder engagement thing, you know, this is interesting, and obviously I'm just trying to save you lots of time and energy by skimming through the different parts, but you can see some of the feedback points that came through in the stakeholder response. So obviously on the gender capture side, they had some complaints that there was lack of alignment with WPATH standards version 8. Thank goodness for that. The need to define it what exceptional circumstances that may warrant prescribing of puberty blockers, and obviously that's what I've just said just now. A request for clarification on the terms early onset and late onset gender dysphoria as used in the equality impact assessment, and that's obviously something I said earlier on a few minutes ago. And then down here we've got to clarify arrangements regarding those currently receiving or starting puberty blockers. Yeah, so basically they're endocrinologists, people, you know, children who are already on it, their consultant can decide whether or not they can stay on it, and that they will do off-label prescribing within the current clinical pathway. And I would imagine that they will stay on them and just be off-label. This is interesting, and I think Transgender Trend might have made a tweet about this in terms of the issue of being on alignment with the WPATH standards. WPATH standards of care do not determine clinical commissioning decisions for the NHS, and I think that is the tweet that they made. In terms of the concerns that were raised in the initial part of the consultation, there certainly would have been something that I had said, and I'm sure many others on the gender critical side had said, that it was completely unethical to continue to prescribe these drugs, even in the context of research, as it constituted medical experiments on children, whilst others suggested that offering puberty blockers only in the context of research would be construed as coercion to participate in research in order to access treatment. And I certainly know that that's something that Susie Green would have said. So that's that document in essence, really. Okay, so on to this one. I'm not sure what we're going to find yet, because I'm just sort of reading it as we go, but I'm already stumbling on these parts. You know, just the kind of just the nonsense in terms of definitions. But here you have the reason why some people experience gender incongruence dysphoria is not fully understood, and it's likely that the development of gender identity is multifactorial and influenced by both biological and social factors. Gender variant behaviours may start between the ages of 3 and 5. Lord alive, honestly. At the same age that most typically developing children begin showing gendered behaviours and interests. I just want to make the point at this here that it's highly convenient, obviously, for them that child development experts, child psychologists, you know, teachers, anyone with, you know, social workers, anyone who's, you know, people who work in child safeguarding, anyone with expertise in child development here is professionally curtailed so much that they're in fear of their jobs for speaking up about the gender wars, because essentially there's never been a better time or more desperate time for them to be able to have their voices heard, to push back against this sort of bollocks, basically, around gender variant behaviours being a pathologized issue, which should, you know, actually sit on a paper, the same paper that talks about, you know, giving drugs for completely normal childhood development. It's just so, given that we know that puberty really is the treatment for, youngsters going through this level of confusion, most of which has been induced by either social media or messaging through schools, etc. A good proportion of it, I suspect. None of this is obviously sort of talked about in these many documents because there's so much repetition. I'm just sort of flicking through some of the other paperwork here. One of the documents does actually have some of the literature that they've called upon. And then what I would do is go through all of the papers just to make sure that I because sometimes there are some spurious things. I am pleased to see they've got Michael Biggs' review of the Dutch protocol in here. So that's a positive, inclusion, even though Michael is actually pro puberty blockers within the research trial, but nevertheless. And then that leads us finally, after a very long journey, to the equality and inequalities impact assessment with regards to the puberty blockers. So let's see if there's anything final to be drawn out of this. So they've obviously given it some thought, but this is a bit weird because they've kind of put this into the long grass. The definition of early onset and late onset will be developed by the clinical study team in due course, and yet it's something, some terms that they're obviously have relied upon in order to, develop this paperwork. This is frustrating because clearly they've already made some kind of assessment here because they've used these terms, so they obviously have an understanding. They're just not sharing it with us because this is relevant to the point where obviously they've made these assertions that where they're saying, once the study opens to recruitment in 2024, only children presenting with early onset gender dysphoria and who meet other key study criteria will be eligible to enroll in the study. However, young people, so children with late onset gender dysphoria, will not be eligible for referral unless an individual referral is approved as exceptional by a multidisciplinary team meeting. So that's a bit vague, but the door isn't shut, so we're not entirely sure what that means because there isn't an age cutoff or the criteria exactly given yet. I just wanted to point out the number of patients under 16 currently on the waiting list. There's 6,000 under 16 on the waiting list. So there's 378 children who are currently on puberty blockers who are going to probably continue on puberty blockers. So all of these individual children are possibly going to have their sexual function stolen, their fertility stolen, bone, brain development issues, etc. So every single one of those children are being essentially morally and ethically written off to, I don't know, in the interest of some kind of research methodology or to be able to publish some information, long-term data about them, it seems. Okay, I've got to the end and it's pretty much the same as the other one. Almost a copy and paste from what I can see. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm obviously done. You're probably done. I think we've done it, champs. We got through all of those paperwork together. So there you have it. That's what I think. Now I will complete my comments and let's see what some of the organizations say on Twitter. If you're still here, yay, thanks.